welcome Andrew Bevan, Director of IGM, International Justice Mission for Scotland. He's joined me today and looking very Christmassy, although it's January. But Andy is, I've known Andy for a long time, and he's what IGM do is honestly mind blowing in the depth of work that they do with regards to campaigns and helping victims or survivors globally. And at this point in time, I must say, Andy, it's fair enough to say 40 million estimated victims of slavery of some shape or form across the globe. It's the biggest human problem that we're facing. Slavery, the numbers of people globally in this type of slavery globally far out surpass what we would have known as traditional slavery from all those years ago. But sorry, I'm talking now. I'd love to introduce Andy Bevan from IGM. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Great, thank you, Shan. Yeah, no, I think this year of all years, we want to prolong the Christmas joy a little bit more, hence why we're still got the Christmas tree going strong.
Great idea. Keep them up all year, keep us smiling
Yes.
after 2020. Andy, you're leading the IGM organisation in Scotland. I'd like you to tell me a little bit about who IGM are before we get into a bit more about yourself. Tell me what IGM do and where they're from, what it means.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks a lot, Shan, for the invitation to share. Great to have the chance to share not only about IGM, but just a really important issue that we need to grapple with in our world. IGM are an organization that works around the world, protecting those who live in poverty from violence. And we do that as an organization that seeks to work alongside and partner with local authorities and with justice systems throughout the world. There's a shocking statistic that the UN put out there a few years ago, and it's an estimated 4 billion people in our world, so about half the world's population, live outside the protection of the rule of law. So that means, half the world's population live in a constant state of vulnerability to acts of common criminal violence. And one of the key manifestations of that violence that we see at IGM is this issue of modern day slavery. As you've mentioned, 40.3 million people in our world live in slavery, and that includes right here in Scotland, but it includes all around the world. So the issue of slavery is truly a global problem that requires both a local and a global response to come alongside it. So IGM was founded back in 1997. And over the 23 years or so, IGM has actually grown to become the world's largest anti-slavery organization. We have about 1,200 staff working all around the world, in different parts of the world, in Asia Pacific, in South Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in North America, and in Latin America. And we come alongside this area of slavery, but also broader issues of violence. And over the 23 years, we've seen almost 60,000 individuals rescued out of different situations of slavery and violence. And then actually the work that we're doing with justice systems is actually bringing about more sustainable change, which maximizes the impact of our work and actually in turn protects other people from being victimized and exploited in the first place. So yeah, that's a little bit of an introduction to the work that we do.
Massive, absolutely massive. I taken the figures, the numbers of people that you're talking about, but just putting that into context about the rule of law and the people that aren't protected, and it makes you realize how lucky we actually are. But even in some of those what we would call civilized nations, that we still have this issue and these problems. And some of the things that I've spoke about is the problems in Scotland. But I've I suppose got involved in raising awareness about the issue that we have domestically in Scotland. You're involved in a far more global nature, aren't you, in IGM, and in particular in your role. You'll have seen things that would make, I'm just thinking of some of the stories that I've heard as well, but just it makes your toes curl to hear some of the stories and some of the things that you've been involved in on the ground.
Yeah.
what's driving you then, Andy? How did you become involved, and what makes you do what you do?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think part of it kind of ties into what you're saying there, Shan, about recognizing that we are so lucky and we're so privileged to um, not only live in a country where you would hope the law will work smoothly, but speaking for myself personally, just the freedom that I have to do different things. So I think something that drives me is actually wanting to use that freedom for good. And I think there's a common humanity to this, isn't there? Like, why is it that I should be able to live in freedom when someone else has been enslaved for decades of their life? And I think something of that ties into my upbringing. My family have brought me up to be someone who looks outwards, not just inwards to our own family, but to look outwards. And I, at the end of 2019, before all the travel bans came in, I had the privilege of going to see IGM's work in South Asia. And when I was there, I met a group of survivors of bonded labor slavery. And I was there with a group of people from the UK. And at the start of the session, these survivors were actually coming towards the end of their 2-year freedom program, which is an aftercare program that anyone who is rescued through IJM in South Asia goes into. It helps them to rebuild their lives. Initial trauma therapy and counseling, but then also building skills that allow them to enter back into society and live and thrive. But we were privileged enough to sit in on one of these sessions, and we got invited to introduce ourselves at the start of it. So I was leading the group, so we went up onto the stage, and I just looked out at the group. There was about 50 or 60 survivors in the room, and I welled up because I've got 2 kids. One is 2, and the other is 4.5. And I looked out at the room, and there were kids the same age as mine. There was mothers and fathers who were like holding their kids in exactly the same way as I would hold mine. There was 4 or 5-year-olds tearing about, not paying any attention to me, but causing havoc in the same way that my 4 or 5-year-old does as well. And it just struck me at that point. I was like, we're so privileged in our own experience, and actually a common humanity calls us to be passionate about this issue and help those who are in need and reach out to those who are marginalized. So yeah, that's a huge thing that drives me. I also believe that this problem can stop. When you hear, figures like 40.3 million people, that's really overwhelming and quite discouraging and disempowering. But if you hear the story of one survivor who has journeyed through this experience and is now living in freedom, that gives you hope for the other folks who are held in slavery. And what's more, like, over the 23 years of IJM, we've seen almost 60,000 people rescued. We've in parts of the world, we've seen the prevalence of the trafficking of children into the sex industry plummet by 79% because of the work that our teams are doing on the ground. So I believe it can stop, as well as I believe it's something that we as human beings should be passionately engaged in.
Fantastic, Andy. I mean, I don't think there's a message that could be any more passionate than what you've just said there about why you do what you do. And if it wasn't for people like you that do what you're doing in organizations such as IGM, there'd be so much more suffering in the world. So thank you, for what you're doing. That's fantastic. So tell me, I suppose you mentioned there about bonded labour and about South Asia. That, you went to visit some of the rescued victims that IGM had supported and helped. How did that happen? What happened, and what was the industry, and what went on there in the background to this?
Yeah, well, across South Asia, the issue of bonded labor slavery or forced labor slavery is huge. Quite often, individuals would take on a loan, and in order to repay that loan, they are invited as an individual, or if they're a family, they're invited as a family to come and work in a particular industry. And that could be anything. That could be making bricks in a brick kiln. That could be digging rocks out of a quarry. It might be in a garment factory. It might be in a rice mill, making rice that goes into global supply chains. So it might be any number of industries. And the problem with bonded labor slavery is that you or your family kind of goes into that situation of work to then find out that it's not the work that you thought it was going to be. And then the debt that you have taken on and you're trying to repay is then held against you. So you're held as a bonded labor slave. So that's kind of the context then. And IJM's worked with families who have had generations of members of their family held in bonded labor slavery because of one person taking on a debt as small as £5. A couple of stories. There was one of this was from a few years ago. IJM was involved in a case that saw a woman called Urmila who was rescued, and Urmila was held for 40 years in a brick kiln in South Asia. And she was enslaved alongside her daughters and then her daughter's family as well. And she was 76 by the time that IJM came alongside her case and worked with the local police and the local authorities in order to rescue her. She was rescued just prior to a general election in India. So in India's world's largest democracy. And Urmila, in her first taste of freedom, wanted to vote in the general election. And our social workers helped her to get her voter card and such like. So it can impact someone who's 76 years old. In my trip just at the end of last year, I met a young woman with a young child, a 4-year-old boy. Her name was Chandrama. And she had taken on some work in what's called a sericulture facility, which is essentially a silkworm harvesting facility. And she was working 16-hour days and had no idea what it was going to be like until she got there. She tried to run away. She got caught by the owners of that facility, and her 4-year-old boy got locked in a room. And she was forced to continue pulling the silk from the silkworms in order to harvest them. And then the silk goes into global supply chains that enters into the fashion industry. And IJM worked alongside the police to not only rescue her, but also her 4-year-old boy and 160 others from that facility. This is what bonded labor slavery looks like in South Asia.
Wow. It sounds like it's another world away, Andy, but when you talk about those two instances, in particular the last one there, what you did mention is that the ended up in the global supply chain, and suddenly you have products that are potentially made by these poor, unfortunate people that have been caught in this, and I'm wearing it, or it's in the products that are in my house. So I mean, Scotland Against Modern Slavery, it's aimed at the business community and raising awareness in the Scottish business community. But I think there's a clear message that's coming out that it's not just it's global. So as a business, and everybody in business are individuals, or they are a consumer. Mm-hmm. What would you suggest advising them? What should they be doing?
Yeah, so I think there's lots we can do individually and lots we can do collectively, whether you're, an employee in a business, whether you're a member of a community group or the faith community. And, we can do stuff as individuals and we can do stuff as groups of people as well. And I guess the first thing is not particularly surprising, but it's actually to raise your voice in this issue, whether that's you raising your voice as an individual in your community or telling your family or telling your neighbors about it, or whether it's you as an employee in a business who actually speaks to his or her boss to actually say, what's our business doing to come alongside this? I often say to people, like, what's in your hands? And that's a kind of weird phrase to say, but I believe that we all have things in our hands, whether that's our passions, whether that's our skills, whether that's our networks that we're a part of. You recognize the things that are in our hands, and then you speak into those things and you see where those conversations take you. So that's one thing that you could do. A second thing, and this is more at a kind of individual level, and I guess ties particularly with what we're saying there about supply chains, is just like think a little bit more about the products that you're buying. Shop ethically, and I know that's kind of quite a trendy, like, hipster thing to do, but actually there's more to it than just that. Is the reason why people want to do that is and should be that actually, it's lives of people. It ties back into our common humanity, what we were mentioning about earlier in the talk, in our conversation.
Yeah.
And a couple of things just to signpost people too, if they're interested. We've IGM UK's website is igmuk.org. And if you go /slave free, that gives you a whole range of advice and resources to help you shop more ethically and help you make more ethical decisions when it comes to, where have my clothes, or where's my food, or my favorite coffee, or whatever it might be, where does it come from? And then I guess the final thing that you might want to do as an individual or as a collective is the whole idea of actually stopping slavery at source. We have a fundamental role to play as consumers in Scotland when it comes to the global supply chain. But matched with us maybe reducing how much we consume in that sense, we also need to look at, okay, what is the problem on the ground, as where these people are being exploited in the first place. And for like a big company, that might be a country that your company has a footprint in and a presence in, and you might want to further look into that. And I guess IJM are on the ground in many parts of the world, and we're looking at stopping slavery at source. We believe that this issue of violence and brokenness or a lack of rule of law in justice systems is really key to actually stopping slavery at source. And just very briefly to give an example, I know I say this, and this is a huge company, but we've been doing some work with the Walmart Foundation for a number of years now. And the Walmart Foundation approached us because they were interested in the whole issue of slavery in the Gulf of Thailand. And the Walmart Foundation funded IJM to do a prevalence study looking at, okay, what is the levels of slavery in the seafood industry in the Gulf of Thailand? And we found out that there was indeed prevalence in the industry. And the foundation then took the next step of actually saying, okay, well, we as a company, we source a lot of our food, our seafood from the Gulf of Thailand. We want to put our money where our mouths is and actually try to stop slavery at source by helping IJM set up an office there, which will in turn begin to address some of these issues of violence, and in turn some of the issues of slavery, and in turn some of the issues of global supply chains, and with that as well. So that's a big company, but as an example of how a company is kind of pressing into stopping slavery at source.
And you don't get much bigger than Walmart, Andy, and they are obviously taking it very seriously, which shows their commitment to doing it. And I think your line, stopping slavery at source, is key to this, isn't it? Because it kind of breaks that chain, and that
Yeah.
suffering that goes all the way along is cut off right at the very, very start. I'd just like to say thank you so much, Andy, for joining me this afternoon. You've been very, very insightful and given a real overview of the global issue, but more importantly about actually doing something about it. As you mentioned earlier on, you could look at the numbers and say 40.3 million people in what we call modern slavery, and it's overwhelming. But actually, you're doing something about it, and your organisation's at the forefront of doing this globally. So I'd just like to say, Andy, thank you so much for your time and your insight. What we'll do is with the podcast, we'll put the link that you mentioned, Slave Free, in the comments box in the YouTube channel so that anyone can click on and follow on with that. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shan.